This was an issue of historic importance, and we fought a huge battle. The atmosphere was very tense, and quite frankly, since I've been in Parliament, there wasn't a week like it.
The Tory MP, Bill Cash, knows what he's talking about. He was at the centre of one of the most dramatic weeks in British parliamentary history. In July 1993, the protracted parliamentary battle over ratification of the Maastricht Treaty reached its climax. That was the European Union Treaty which John Major was backing against the bitter opposition of his party's Eurosceptics, like Bill Cash. The treaty, and possibly even the survival of the government, were threatened. But how did a few rebels come to pose such a danger? Douglas Hurd was Foreign Secretary at the time.
There was an alliance, quite unscrupulous really, between the Labour Party, which was in favour of the treaty but wanted to dish the government, and our rebels, which didn't want to dish the government but were prepared to do so in order to dish the treaty.
By mid-July, the bill had passed all its parliamentary stages, but the government still faced one final hurdle, a vote on the controversial social chapter, a hurdle that Major himself described as a ticking time bomb. Norman Fowler was Conservative Party chairman.
The social chapter opt-out vote could not have been more worrying. Right from the beginning, it was a vote that, frankly, we didn't expect to win.
On Thursday, July the 15th, it was announced that the countdown had begun.
Mr. Major and his cabinet fight to save their version of the Maastricht Treaty. The last crucial votes will be next Thursday. There is a real possibility of a government defeat.
The vote was to be a week later, on Thursday the 22nd of July. The rebels thought there was a real possibility that by defeating the government over the social chapter, they might destroy the entire Maastricht Treaty.
Oh, I think it was definitely a very serious chance. There was a lot of lobbying going on both sides.
For Bill Cash and his fellow Eurosceptics, scuppering the treaty was a matter of the utmost importance.
It was about the question, ultimately, of who governs Britain. It created new dimensions in the field of foreign policy and defence, the rights of citizens, economic and monetary union. In other words, it created the ingredients for European government.
For John Major, the political stakes were enormous. Ken Clarke, a pro-European and one of Major's key allies, was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
John Major had produced a deal, he agreed it with all the other heads of government in Europe, and it's fatal to the authority of a Prime Minister if he comes back and then can't get his Parliament to endorse the deal he has signed on behalf of his government.
With so much at stake and just a week to play with, both sides embarked on a frenzy of strategy meetings, frantic attempts to persuade wavering colleagues, briefings and counter-briefings. By Sunday, a worried Major was trying desperately to downplay the danger to his premiership.
The Prime Minister has said his job is not at stake in this week's crucial vote on Maastricht. He said the treaty's social chapter was a charter for unemployment.
The social chapter, which regulated working conditions, was loved by Labour but hated by Tories, including the Eurosceptics. When John Major had negotiated the Maastricht Treaty with the rest of the EU, he'd secured an opt-out on this for Britain. However, with their eye firmly on the big picture of destroying the treaty as a whole, the rebels were preparing to vote for the social chapter. Ministers professed astonishment. Norman Fowler.
I was amazed. I mean, we'd all spent goodness knows how many years. I'd been employment secretary. I can remember back in the 1980s going on about the social chapter and its evil ways. And here we were with, up to 20 of our colleagues who were prepared to go and vote with Labour and bringing the social chapter into effect. It was a pretty extraordinary sight.
But Cash defends the rebels' position as logical and principled.
The attempt to try to demonstrate that by voting the way we did on the social chapter was somehow unprincipled is complete nonsense, because it was a disreputable trick to try to associate the two, and in fact the Maastricht Treaty, when lost, would have taken the social chapter down with it.
As the week progressed, ministers did all they could to bring the rebels back into line. Nicholas Winterton, an ardent Eurosceptic, remembers being on the receiving end.
They did bring pressure through my association, but fortunately a majority of my association were very supportive. And very late in the day, I did have a one-to-one lengthy meeting with the Prime Minister, John Major. Because of the huge interest in the media and the cameras outside 10 Downing Street, they requested that I did not enter Downing Street through the front door, but that I actually be smuggled into Downing Street through the Cabinet Office.
While the government were busy applying a mixture of charms and thumbscrews, it seems they weren't the only ones working on the waverers. Ken Clark.
I always personally accepted the stories that 10 people who were wavering were being wheeled down to the House of Lords to meet Margaret Thatcher, who would address them severely and get them to stiffen up and go back and vote against the government. I think she was an important weapon in the Eurosceptic armoury.
By the day of the vote, Westminster was in a state of high tension. The leading sceptics were desperately hoping their backers would stay solid, and the Cabinet met 3 times that day to agree tactics as the crisis unfolded.
Good afternoon. It's the darkest moment of John Major's Prime Ministership. In 9 hours' time, the Commons votes on whether or not to force the social chapter into the Maastricht Treaty. The result is impossible to forecast.
The Commons debate was passionate, and even as MPs were speaking, the government continued their efforts to quell the rebellion. Bill Cash.
I obviously had to be in the chamber, and therefore I had no idea who they were trying to track down and what was going on behind the scenes. But reports were coming into the chamber the whole time that there were pressures being exerted and people were being asked questions about what they were proposing to say to their constituents and all this sort of thing.
As the voting began, some of the apparent pressures on rebels were reported live on Newsnight by commentator John Sopel.
Nicholas Winterton had a whip, his hand on one shoulder and his other hand round the waist of Nicholas Winterton and pushing him, propelling him through into the government lobby.
But as Nicholas Winterton told me, this was not what it seemed.
I was seen to be arm in arm with a whip. It wasn't that I was being physically forced into the government lobby on that occasion. It was them showing, I think, some gratitude.
Gratitude? Because at the last minute, Winterton had decided not to vote against the government after all. To the amazement of some colleagues, he'd been won over by government assurances about the UK's veto under Maastricht, which had partly allayed his concerns. 2 other rebels, Michael Lord and John Carlyle, made clear during the debate that they too would support the government. Was the rebellion crumbling? Major later confessed that during the debate he'd hoped for a stampede from the rebels' camp back to the government. Excitement mounted as MPs waited for the result, which was reported live on Newsnight.
Hang on a second, I'm just being told that something's going on in the House of Commons. Let's go down there.
Any moment now, look at the Labour chairs. Let's get the vote. Any moment.
The ayes to the right, 316. The noes to the left, 324.
The government had been defeated by 8 votes, and the Maastricht Treaty was in jeopardy. It was the outcome government business managers had dreaded. But the Cabinet had already worked out how to respond, having met again shortly before the vote took place. Douglas Hurd.
It was a crucial meeting because, once again, we were told we were going to lose the vote on the social chapter, which scuppered the whole thing. And Michael Howard, who was known to be a sceptic, a very honourable sceptic, he proposed, and Ken Clark supported him, that if we lost, we should at once say we were going to have a vote of confidence the next day. If Michael Howard had not done that, and if we'd got into one of those circular arguments that tired politicians sometimes do get into at moments of crisis, I don't know what would have happened.
But some members of the Cabinet had wanted to abandon the treaty altogether, or simply leave the issue unresolved over the summer. The decision hadn't been reached easily, as Ken Clark recalls.
The Cabinet itself was a genuine discussion. It went backwards and forwards. The whole thing was, I think, unusually determined by the climate of debate in the Cabinet. It was not a given. It could have gone either way.
Crucially, the government had agreed not just to a vote of confidence, but a confidence vote framed specifically to enable the government to ratify the treaty. It was an audacious move.
It's a very big step for a government to say, on a subject where it's just lost a vote, that it's now going to make its very survival dependent on effectively the same issue being put again, and backbench members of Parliament being persuaded to vote for it.
It was a very high-risk strategy, and we knew that. That's why we only took that decision. It was only put to us really minutes, or an hour or two, before the actual vote, because we needed to be, up against the fence before we took it.
The rebels were now faced with a deeply unpalatable choice: to back down and let the Maastricht Treaty through, or to precipitate a general election which would bring almost certain victory for Labour, who would then also ratify the treaty and bring in the social chapter. Although ministers hoped the rebels would back down, they didn't dare risk leaving it to chance. Douglas heard again.
Next morning, I, Foreign Secretary and others, spent interviewing particular rebels. We played the nuclear weapon. They didn't really want an election. We were calling their bluff, and they fell away. They crumbled.
Indeed, all but one of the rebels supported the government in Friday's confidence vote. The Maastricht Treaty could now be ratified without further ado. But John Major's hopes that the confidence debate would mark the end of the whole affair were soon dashed. Bill Cash.
He came to see me during the debate before Douglas Hurd got up to speak, and he said to me, "It's all over now, isn't it, Bill?" And I said, "No, it's not." I said, "It's just beginning again."
The war was indeed far from over, and that night Major inadvertently fanned the flames by describing some of the Eurosceptics as bastards in a leaked, off-the-record conversation. Major's anger reflected his frustration at the deep troubles he'd been struggling with. The overall impact of that week was highly damaging. Nicholas Winterton.
The Prime Minister came out of that whole week, that saga in our history, a weakened man, and that contributed to the horrible annihilation of the Conservative Party at the 1997 election.
But Winterton also feels the assurances he was given by the government were not honoured. His decision to back the government on that crucial Thursday is one of the main regrets of his long parliamentary career.
I've learnt through a bitter experience, and I have to say, if I was able to live my political life again, there is very little that I would change. That is one thing that I would change. I would have voted against on Maastricht. To my mind, God gave me instinct, and you should generally follow that instinct.
Although the rebels lost the battle that week, they subsequently won the war inside the Conservative Party. Bill Cash.
The Conservative Party has now become entirely Eurosceptic. It took time for people to absorb all the arguments, because it looked as if, as indeed was the case, that we were opposing our own government. And the question they were asking was why. And the answer is very simple: because what was happening under Maastricht was the creation of the foundations of European government, and the Conservative Party is opposed to that now, but the origins of it were in the Maastricht Treaty and in those debates.
But Ken Clarke has this cautionary reminder for the Eurosceptics.
I think there could be some argument in the argument that the Eurosceptics lost the battle that won the war, because up until Maastricht, the Conservative Party had been a pro-European party. Margaret Thatcher always said we should be at the heart of Europe. But as a pro-European, I would also say that if that was the turning point between the old Conservative Party and the new nationalist Conservative Party, well, the old Conservative Party is the one that used to win elections. And they won the war inside the Conservative Party, and they share a very large amount of the blame for taking the Conservative Party into long-lasting opposition.